The first of tonight's speakers, Eric Liu, is a Seattle-based author and educator, a crack interviewer, and a civic catalyst who has served as a White House speechwriter for President Bill Clinton and an executive at Real Networks. In the present tense, he lectures at the University of Washington, hosts the television interview program Seattle Voices, and has served on the boards of the Seattle Public Library, the League of Education Voters, and the Swedish Medical Center Foundation. Oh, and a little place called Town Hall Seattle. Never heard of it. Liu is the author of 1998's The Accidental Asian, a New York Times notable book featured in the PBS documentary Matters of Race, and of 2004's Guiding Lights. This book is the touchstone for his most recent project, an ongoing project, I should say, the Guiding Lights Network. Meanwhile, his partner in civic imagination is Nick Hanauer, a Seattle-based entrepreneur and venture capitalist whose projects have included founding and eventually selling Aquantive Incorporated, early investment and board advisement to Amazon.com and FoundingGear.com, and key management roles and investments in a number of other companies. He co-founded the League of Education Voters and has served on the boards of the Cascade Land Conservancy, the University of Arizona's Mount Lemmon Science Center, and the Biosphere 2 Climate Research Project. Together, Liu and Hanauer co-authored the 2008 book, The True Patriot, from which they built the True Patriot Network to advance the book's ideals of progressive patriotism. Their new collaboration is The Gardens of Democracy, a new American story of citizenship, the economy, and the role of government, and it's the subject of tonight's talk. Please join me in welcoming back Nick Hanauer and Eric Liu.
Yeah, it's great. This is a lean forward environment, and we have lean back chairs. So. Ware, thank you so much for that introduction. I just wanted, before we get into the heart of things, really underscore something, which is what an incredible gift Town Hall is to our region and community. And I want to kind of underscore his pitch there. Your presence here means I'm preaching to the converted already, but we believe that one of the things that makes this community what it is this place, and we're grateful to be a part of this. We have a fun evening in store here where we want to tell you a bit about this new book that we've created and some of the ideas that we framed in it, and then open it up to a wider conversation. As Ware mentioned, Nick and I wrote a book together a few years ago called The True Patriot, and for those of you who aren't familiar with it, that book was really a short argument in pamphlet style that progressives needed to reclaim and reframe patriotism. And this book in many ways builds upon the foundation laid by the True Patriot in ways that we're going to talk about in just a moment. This book is building on the moral values foundation of the True Patriot to talk more generally about how we govern ourselves and what it means, in fact, to tend the gardens of our democracy. One of the things that we would say about this book, Gardens, that we said a little bit in the True Patriot, but I think in this moment right now, as we gather here today in this extraordinary time of political turbulence at home and abroad, is that in some ways all bets are off. All ways that we've inherited of thinking about politics are now under question. All the notions of what government is for, what an economy is for, as John DeGraff will be talking about later this month, these first principles questions are being relitigated and re-examined. And one of the things that is exciting to us about this moment is, while that can be destabilizing and dangerous, it's also a time for imagination, for civic imagination. And one of the things that we did in this book, Gardens of Democracy, is to try to come at things not in the tired old frame of left and right that has so dominated and in many ways polarized our politics, but rather to think orthogonally and to think about the problems and the solutions that are ahead of us in ways that sometimes will borrow from left and or right, but belong not necessarily to either side. And that notion of coming at things orthogonally is one of the kind of foundational things that we wanted to say about setting the tone here about the purposes of this book.
Yeah, and I also wanted to thank Town Hall for having us here and just to acknowledge what an incredible civic gift it is to the city. And we're excuse me, not everybody in every place has a forum like this in which citizens get to gather. Yeah, I just wanted to underscore one of the things that Eric said, which is that our political culture poses the great questions that face the nation as these sort of ridiculous, polarizing false choices between suffocating collectivism or free market fundamentalism. I think that, for many, many citizens, politics, it seems like this tug-of-war between the far left and the far right. And, our view is that we need to somehow find a way to pull sideways, and that the best solutions will be found in a dimension other than the left-right continuum that we've been struggling with for so long. I think there's a very shorthanded way to understand what we attempted to do in this book, and it relates to the first one, which is, excuse me, in the True Patriot, we argued that largely that it was immoral to be selfish as a citizen, and that true patriotism actually meant putting others in the country before self. In this argument, so there we argued that selfishness was morally wrong. In this book, we argue further that it's stupid. That is to say that being selfish and short-sighted isn't just amoral or immoral. It actually it works counter to your actual self-interest, and that fundamentally, when you understand the world in a more sophisticated way than we have in the past, that these new models and metaphors make that much clearer.
So just to give you a quick roadmap of what we're going to lay out here in our remarks as a way to frame the discussion, and then, as Ware said, we would like to open up as much of the time as we can just for good conversation. So the beats that we want to hit this evening, in the first place, are just to talk about what we even mean when we say the gardens of democracy. And as I'll explain in a moment, kind of these two very differing notions of how to see the world and the way people behave. One that we call machine brain, and one that we call garden brain. And then from there, we're going to talk about citizenship. From there, we're going to talk about the nature of self-interest, as Nick just alluded to a moment ago, which is the motor force for politics and economics, and yet is one of the least understood things that drives human behavior. And then we're going to talk about, in turn, citizenship, the economy, and the role of government, and the ways that all three of those pillars of public life are understood differently when you see them through the lens that we're going to describe in just a moment. So, machine brain versus garden brain. So, the title of this book, The Gardens of Democracy, reflects the fact that for centuries, from the founding of this country, the dominant metaphor for understanding how the world works in American life has been the machine, that we think in mechanistic terms. And so that the way we think about the economy, the way we think about how government works, all the language and metaphors we use are machine metaphors. The idea that the economy is this equilibrium, self-correcting machine. The language of economics is a language of 19th century physics, and the language of how government works and the way that government policies ought to work is the language in many ways of either industrial machines or, in more recent times, essentially vending machines, right? You put in your coin, you push your button, and if you don't get your service, you kick the thing, right? And that's our notion of what it means to engage with government. And part of the belief that we have here is that while in some ways that metaphor of a machine has served us well in understanding and making sense of things, we're certainly at a time right now where that metaphor absolutely fails us. And that it is long past time to switch from the metaphor of the machine to the metaphor of a garden, and understand the world not in mechanistic terms, but in terms of ecosystems, complex, adaptive systems. Systems that, if you think about the economy, an economy is not a machine that self-corrects, and an economy no more self-corrects than a garden self-tends. Gardens require gardeners. Gardeners require weeding and seeding and feeding. And the same is true for government, and the same is true for civic life. And these two competing mindsets that we depict in this little visual from our book between machine brain and garden brain aren't just at the level of metaphor. If you unpack them, there are notions built into them about assumptions about how humans behave, right? And so machine brain thinks of us as atomized. It thinks of us as highly rational It thinks of us as calculating and selfish, as Nick was alluding to a moment ago. And it assumes that things just self-regulate on their own. Garden brain, by contrast, and the virtue of starting our book tour in Seattle is that we're starting in a town of gardeners. As everybody here knows, gardens are not mechanistic. Gardens are complex and adaptive, and you can't just be rational about them. They're approximating. They're dynamic and evolving systems. And the ways that one thinks about social life and civic life when you have garden brain turned on turns out to be very different from the way that you think about things when you have machine brain on. And as we're going to discuss at greater length, that has great implications for the way you think about citizenship, the economy, and the role of government. But what it has particular implications for is how you conceptualize the simple idea of self-interest, which Nick is going to speak to in a moment.
Great. You should know that this is the first time we've ever talked to a group about this material. So, and this is our new slide deck, which took 10 minutes to make. So, what Eric talked about was the difference between machine brain and garden brain, and the difference in both the nature and the power of the metaphors that they represent. But what's worth underscoring is not just that we need to shift metaphors, but that more broadly, we have over the last 40 to 50 years gone through a scientific revolution which matches, in our view, in importance, the Enlightenment. So since approximately 1965, scientists and mathematicians have been unraveling the mysteries of systems, and the idea that was present for the prior 300 years, that all the systems that we inhabit and the behaviors that we see in them are linear, has been demolished, has been pushed aside for a much richer and more powerful understanding of the systems that we inhabit, things like ecosystems and economies and the networks in which we live, as complex and adaptive. And it is just, it's not a matter of perception or feeling anymore. It's really a matter of fact that the systems we inhabit as human beings are complex, adaptive, and are much more like, aren't just, an economy, for instance, isn't like an ecosystem. It actually is a type of an ecosystem. It's an incredibly important shift. And that understanding, let's go to the next slide, has a very transformational forcing function on how you understand yourself and how you interact in the world. Self-interest itself is, the intensity of self-interest, in our view, over time and history, is relatively unchanging. People are self-interested, and they remain intensely so across time and culture. But what does change profoundly from time to time is how people define self-interest. And our view is that politics, in many ways, can be imagined simply as an expression of what the culture thinks their self-interest is. And so, in order for politics to change a lot, people have to change their views a lot about where their self-interest lies. And it's our view, and one of the fundamental theses of this book, that we are at one of those moments, that a revolution in scientific understanding is going to animate profound changes in how people see their self-interest, and therefore how they might how they'll permit themselves to reimagine the other social system around them: citizenship, economics, and the role of government. And I just wanted to point out a few. This is a long and complicated subject, and a hugely difficult part of writing this book was trying to synthesize a large number of incredibly complicated ideas. But there is a huge difference between understanding yourself living in a simple versus a complex system. There's a huge difference between understanding yourself as atomized versus on a network. there's a huge difference between understanding the system in which you live as, for instance, an equilibrium system versus a non-equilibrium system. And I'll just touch on a couple of these examples. We could go on and on. But if you imagine you live in a linear system, then another fish out of the sea is just another fish out of the sea. Once you recognize that it's complex and adaptive, then you have to confront the fact that another fish out of the sea may start a cascade of extinction. And so your perception about risk can change dramatically. And as we come to understand the systems around us in this way, it begins to shape how we view ourselves and how we operate with respect to one another. I'm just trying to think. It's worth highlighting a little bit the difference that this revolution in understanding has had around how we view the agents in the system. So for 300 years, there's been this operating, basically guiding principle about human behavior, which undergirds all traditional economics, which is that people are rational, calculating and self-interest, and indeed all modern economics depends on people being perfectly rational calculators of their self-interest. But it turns out that that assumption is completely wrong, that we know now that people aren't selfish, they're what's called strongly reciprocal, they're not calculating, it turns out they're approximating, and they're not rational, they turn out to be emotional. And that change in understanding of how human beings actually are either does or should have a profound impact on how we reconceptualize how we build social systems. And with that, I think it's worth starting with citizenship.
You know, if there's one way I would sum up these changes, it goes back to this idea that true self-interest
That's right.
is mutual interest, right? And that this, again, this sounds like just a little precept to buzz by, but I invite you to sit with it for a moment, because everything from our theories of what an economy, a capitalist economy is, to our notion laid out in Federalist 10 of how we in selfish, self-interested factions bump around each other like atoms and fight one another, does not give full credence to the idea that we are in a web woven together with our fates entwined, and that there is no way to cabin off my self-interest from yours. There's no way to cut off my fate from yours, right? And that mutuality has long been, of course, an ethical precept that people of all different faith and spiritual and political traditions have spoken of. But what, as Nick said, what we have right now in this moment is an incredible volume, virtually a second Enlightenment's worth of science to now give factual emphasis behind this moral precept. And I think that's just one of the most important things we can recognize at the baseline level. And it changes, certainly, the way you do think about citizenship. And so one of the other precepts that we have here for the citizenship section of the book is simply this one, that society becomes how you behave. Okay, again, please sit with that for just a second. Because our prevailing mythology in the marketplace and in public life generally is that, you know, as long as I'm not actively hurting anybody else, I should be able to do whatever the heck I want, right? Moreover, if I'm being a selfish, antisocial jerk, in the big scheme of things, my jerkiness is going to get canceled out by someone else's saintliness, right? And it all kind of works out in the end. And indeed, you know, somehow magically we all believe in this gospel that a million acts of raw selfishness and self-seeking add up to a common good, right? That is the prevailing language and idea of things, and it is literally and figuratively a rationalization, right? It tries to make rational sense of something in a way that excuses us of responsibility. And I think one of the things that we came to recognize in thinking about citizenship and the meaning of citizenship is this. Our idea of what it means to live in this democracy and to share civic life is not one in which you're allowed to do whatever the heck you want, and it is not one in which we are mere spectators, mere customers who get to be cranky and kick that vending machine or get to be grumpy about the people we see on TV called our leaders, right? That citizenship is not merely that kind of disengaged consumerhood. That citizenship, great citizenship, means ownership. Ownership of responsibility of every aspect of how society works. And when you see the world through the kind of garden brain lens and see it as complex and adaptive and see us as networked and see us as incredibly interdependent, it changes the way you think about, again, what it means to, we have in the house here somebody who wrote a book by this title, what it means to show up for life, what it means to show up, right? And so one of the things that it makes you realize in civic life is that there's no simple way in this kind of networked web to disavow even the smallest kinds of responsibility. Some of you have heard me say this, but a month or two ago, I saw this great billboard. Someone posted it on Facebook. I'm not even sure. It might have been from Portland or somewhere. And it was a billboard on the side of some very congested highway. And it reminded folks on the highway, it said, you are not stuck in traffic. You are traffic. Which is a pretty good way of rethinking what the heck we're doing, right? You don't get to just grouse and say, man, traffic stinks in my town, and I'm so mad, and that leads me to either believe we ought to, do this transportation policy or that policy or whatever, as if we had nothing to do with the problem, as if we weren't, in fact, the co-authors of the problem, right? And our notion of citizenship requires that you recognize that society becomes how you behave. Right? And so that just changes the way you think about things. On my way over here, it's rush hour and lots of people are trying to get places. It's the holidays. And, at one intersection, people were trying to jam in a little bit, when they shouldn't have been trying to jam in, right? And you just have these little micro choices every day. And you can choose in that moment either to say, you know what, it's a dog-eat-dog world. It's 6:53, I'm late, and I'm getting there, right? And I'm going to cut this guy off. And in machine brain, you think, well, A, that's selfish and rational and to be rewarded, and B, even if it kind of hurts that guy's feelings, it'll all wash out, right? It'll all come out in the wash. Our view is that this kind of behavior is contagious. And so if you are discourteous in traffic, guess what happens? That guy who I've just cut off decides he gets infected. He decides next time around, it might be next week, it might be in 5 minutes, that the next opportunity he gets, he's going to pass on just that same kind of behavior. He's going to cut off the next guy in traffic. He's going to be discourteous, right? And this may seem like a very simple homespun example of courtesy and civility in something like traffic, but it is, in the fractal way that all of these systems interact that we've been describing, it is a perfect little emblem for the larger point we're trying to make. If you choose to be discourteous in traffic, society becomes discourteous. If you choose to be civil or uncivil in a public gathering, society becomes civil or uncivil. If you choose to be compassionate as you walk past someone or come upon someone in pain, society becomes compassionate or not, right? And life on a network like this, in this entwined complex system, on the one hand, you might think as a matter of citizenship, that, boy, this is a very disempowering thing, right? I mean, we're just little nodes on a network, and we're all part of the Borg kind of collective, and no one has free will. That's not true at all. Our view about the power of citizenship in this interdependent networked world is that it gives incredible power to each individual, incredible power and responsibility to each of us to set off cascades, to set off contagions of behavior, right? And that civic life, long before you get to how a bill becomes a law, right? Long before you get to the machinery of politics that people are taught, or not even so much anymore, taught in civics classes, is a whole set of ethical understandings of how to be and how to be together. And that understanding, in our view, is completely transformed when you think about things through this lens. And because of that, and in the same ways, our notions then of how we interact with one another, not only as citizens and fellow members of a civic body, but as economic actors, as participants in a great economy, that changes as well. And that's the next. One other point I just want to make about this slide here, about traffic. This little graphic here depicts the simple fact that there's something counterintuitive about the idea that in order to advance, you should yield, right? That when you yield in traffic, for instance, it may feel like you're a sucker or you're a loser, right? But in fact, what happens in the aggregate for all of us is that traffic moves along better and that we as a society advance more quickly, right? And it is the sum of these little choices, counterintuitive as they may feel and as unsatisfying to our road rage hormones and emotions, that yielding leads to advance. I think that's one central precept.
I just wanted to underscore or emphasize a point that I think Eric didn't make, which is that our argument, our fundamental argument in this book is that that the assertions that Eric made aren't matters of opinion or feeling. What we're asserting, the reason we wrote the book, is that we believe these are matters of fact. That in fact, we are networked. In fact, our behaviors are contagious. In fact, society becomes how you behave. and that there is this overwhelming body of scientific work and mathematical work over the last 40 years which informs this view, and that it is this tidal wave of this completely new way of understanding how the world works that should jolt us into these new ways of understanding how the world fits together. The way in which we sum up our view of how the economy works is here. It's obvious. This is obviously a very different from the story that we have been told about the economy over the last 40 years, which is if a few people are better off, maybe some of the rest of us will be. But the essential lesson that that understanding the economy as an ecosystem teaches you is that we're all better off when we're all better off. That for a very long time, economies have been understood mechanistically and linearly, and those metaphors permit you to believe and make a very persuasive case for some what would turn out to be some very, very crazy things. So at the core of that mechanistic understanding is what's called the efficient market hypothesis, the Chicago School understanding of how the economy works, and it literally is the assertion that the economy is this perfectly efficient mechanistic sort of thing where every transaction is this sort of perfectly efficient transaction, and there's all sorts of ways to understand how crazy that is. But one of the ways in which to best understand it is to reflect on the fact that after this crash in 2007 or 8, the federal government of the United States got the smartest economists in the country together in a room to try to figure out what went wrong. And when they started to look at what's called the general stochastic equilibrium model that the government uses to predict what will happen, one of the shocking things that people finally came to terms with was that there were no banks in that model. You say, how could the government have a model of the economy that didn't include any banks? And the reason for that is that if you believe in the efficient market hypothesis, then you also believe that banks are this sort of pass-through, that they actually, in theory, don't exist, because the people who run the banks are perfectly rational and perfectly calculating and perfectly selfish. And so what they do just sort of cancels out. So there are 70 million households in the country. Guess how many households were modeled in the model the federal government uses to predict what's going to happen? One perfectly rational, happy little family. No differences in circumstance, no differences in geography. And so you can see, obviously, those assumptions will take you down the road to despair, obviously, and they did. When you understand the economy as an ecosystem, you come to very, very different conclusions about what's important and how you might arrange it to create prosperity. And I just wanted to hit on a few of those. The first is that some of you may have seen, I'll start by talking about jobs. I mean, some of you may have seen, I authored an op-ed based on these ideas in the book that appeared in Bloomberg a week ago, which according to the editors was unprecedented in their history in terms of reaction. And it made a very simple argument, which is that the rich are not job creators. Actually, middle-class consumers are job creators. And the argument goes like this, that for a very long time, there's been this sort of generalized assertion in discussions of political economy that if you pour money into rich people and business people in the form of tax breaks and increasing wages, and pour money into corporations in the form of increasing profits, that jobs will somehow squirt out the other side of them. And you know, if this was true, we would be awash in jobs, because over the last 30 years, the income share for the wealthiest Americans has gone up someplace between 300 and 500%, depending on how you measure it, and the tax rate on them has come down someplace between 50 and 75%, depending on how you measure it. And so, obviously, if giving money to rich people created jobs, we would have lots of jobs, and we don't. The truth is that jobs are a consequence of the feedback loop between customers and businesses. And the way to create jobs is to have more middle-class people who want to buy things from businesses. There's another way to put a finer point on how ridiculous this claim is, that business people create jobs, which is to reflect on the fact that business people fundamentally do two things. And I'm one. I'm quite an experienced one. You do two things. The first thing you do is that you work on creating revenue, sales, right? Work on sales, sales, sales. But you devote an equal amount of time to something else, which is called contain costs. In other words, don't create jobs. So most business people devote at least 50% of their time to trying their hardest in every possible way they can to not create jobs. And the difference between a good business person and a bad business person is largely your ability to not create jobs. Because the more revenue you create and the fewer jobs you have, the more profit you get, right? So to say, to claim that business people create jobs is like squirrels claiming that they create evolution. It's literally the other way around. And this is so obvious when you understand it as a complex adaptive system. It's so obvious when you understand it as an ecosystem, but it's opaque if you have this. You have this sort of mechanistic, sort of donut machine metaphor in your mind, where you pour, ingredients in and stuff squirts out. Another incredibly easy, another very important way in which this metaphor is clarifying is the way in which it allows you to understand inequality as the enemy of prosperity. Again, if your metaphors are mechanistic, the richer the rich get, somehow the better off it will be for everybody, because again, you're pouring money in the rich people, and the good stuff is squirting out the other side. But when you understand it as a feedback loop, as this sort of circle of life thing, I sometimes think that all you need to know about economics is watching The Lion King. You learn a lot, and great inequality is the enemy of prosperity, because it creates this unholy feedback loop where you have this population of people who don't care what prices are, and they push the prices up for everything, and they accumulate all the money, and the vast majority of people are struggling to keep up. And so what do? They start to borrow, right? Which is what our middle class has done, is start to borrow to keep up. And who will lend them the money? The rich, who have accumulated all this, this huge amount of capital, and because they need to financialize these assets, they lend them money at, on crazy terms, and of course, eventually, that whole house of cards falls down. This is exactly what happened in 2008. It's exactly what happened in 1929, and only by understanding the world as this series of feedback loops does it make it transparently obvious how destructive inequality is to general prosperity. With that, I think it's worth talking about how you might organize a government to make some sense of this stuff.
This, by the way, is
Oh, yeah.
something we're quite fond of, a little visual depiction of the kind of inequality that Nick was talking about in the economy and the way that...
Yeah, and so this is another way to understand how insidious inequality is that if you understand the economy as a circulation system, right, rather than as essentially as a donut machine, then you come away with a couple of new ideas. One of them is that if you allow all of the money to clot in a tiny little spot in the economy, that can't be good, right? And so when you reflect on what's happened to the United States, this economy, so in 1980, the top 1% got about 8% of the national share of income, and the bottom 50% shared about 18% of national income. By basically today, 30 years later, the top 1% shares about 25% of income, so up 300%, and the bottom 50% of Americans now share 12% of income. So we have literally taken 25% of the lifeblood of our economy, and we have stuck it essentially in 1% of our, corpus, essentially. Imagine the big toe. And you can imagine how crappy the rest of the body feels, right? And that is literally what has happened to our economy. We have sucked the lifeblood out of most of it and stuck it in this little tiny place. There's another observation that actually is very, very interesting that understanding the economy as a circulation system allows you to make. And that is that the entire conception that most Americans have of what government does is spending, right? Who agrees? The government spends. We agree? Surely you agree. Everybody agrees. Spending, spending, spending. It's terrible. They spend too much, blah, 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 blah. But if you understand money as the lifeblood of a circulation system, then you have to acknowledge all of a sudden that the government doesn't spend a dime. The federal government of the United States of America does not spend a dime. What they do is they circulate money, right? Because even the lowliest, laziest, most useless government worker is still some small business person's best customer, right? No, so there's this conception. So spending, the word spending actually means to destroy value, right? To extinguish value. But the government doesn't actually push our money into tax dollars into piles and burn it. It goes in and it comes out somewhere else. Now, we can argue about how effective the places are that they circulate it to, and you can have a very robust civic conversation about what the best ways to circulate money are. But the money is not destroyed, it is circulated. And this is why, this is a great conundrum for the right. How can it be that government spending goes up every year and yet the society becomes more prosperous? Because if you understand it as spending, it's like destroying the money, right? But it's not destroyed, it's circulated.
So that is actually a great segue into this last of the chunks that we want to talk about, which is the role of government and the ways in which this worldview, this garden brain view, makes you rethink the role of government. And the way we would distill this is the following. Let me unpack this statement here, big what, small how. So a lot of what happens today, one of the ways in which our politics is in such a tired Groundhog Day repeating loop of the same old useless tropes and rhetorical frames is this argument that goes on between Republicans and Democrats, between small government and big government, right? That our whole idea of the role of government is one to be evaluated on a scale of bigness versus smallness. And one of the arguments that we make here in this book is that is an overly simplistic way to look at things. That the right way to think about government is that what we want is a government that is big on the what, but small on the how. A government that sets great goals and direction and has a sense of strategy, but then is far more hands-off and agnostic as to how citizens, local governments, individuals actually go after getting those goals, right? Now, this is one signal example of what we were describing earlier as kind of orthogonal thinking, because it may sound, there's cognitive dissonance when you hear this, right? Big goals and light touch on the means. Is that a liberal or a conservative idea? And the answer is yes, right? The answer is very much yes. And I think one of the things that, listening to what Nick had to say about circulation, one thing that we have to recognize when you talk about circulation and this, quote-unquote idea of spending, is that one of the foundational jobs of government is to make sure that when you think about that big toe clotting up with 24% of the nation's lifeblood, is to make sure that you don't have that kind of clotting, right? Is to make sure that you don't get monopolies of opportunity and self-reinforcing concentrations, not only of wealth, but of the opportunity to gain more wealth, right? And the role of government here, you'll hear arguments in one of the frames that's out there is about, socialist redistribution, and that government should have no hand in redistributing wealth. And part of our view is, again, if you see things through the lens that we're offering here, you realize government is always redistributing. Government cannot not redistribute if it's a going concern. The only question is in which direction. That's the only question, right? And for the last 30 years, we have had a government that has been aggressively redistributing wealth from the middle class and the working class to the already wealthy, right? Those statistics, those trend lines that Nick described were not accidents. They were not just kind of interesting features of our changing times. They were the very predictable result of a set of government choices and policies, tax policies to reduce the tax burden on the wealthiest Americans, policies to disinvest in the middle class, right? And so when you think about a big what, small how government, you think one of our first responsibilities in a shared experience like this, in this democratic republic, in a country like this founded on an idea and not on anything else of blood or territory or what have you, one of the basic things that we should ask government to do is to make sure that opportunity is continuously recirculated, right? That's one of the biggest whats in a big what list. If government is not doing that, if the American government is not doing that, then you truly can and should be asking, well, what the heck is it for, right? What is this game actually rigged to do and to produce? And our idea here in thinking about big what, small how, is that one of the things that we have right now in our politics, on the left, we have a lot of legacy thinking that we would describe shorthand basically as big what, big how, right? So liberals from the New Deal through the Great Society and to our own time today do believe in great goals, but also believe in a very robust role for the state in actually figuring out how we get there, right? The right, by contrast, has a view of the world that we would shorthand as small what, small how, right? In which they don't grant government, national government, much role or responsibility to set goals for what we want to be together, where we want to go as a country, and we certainly don't want to have anything to say about how people get there. And then you have, even farther libertarians who we shorthand with all warmth and friendliness as a know what, know how view of the world and view of government. The idea of big what, small how, let me just make it somewhat more concrete and give an example or two. So one example is, Nick and I both spent a lot of time on public education issues. And one example actually comes from the Obama administration's initiative a year or two ago called Race to the Top. Now, those of you who are familiar with Race to the Top, there are plenty of things to quarrel about in terms of, how they did it, what their goals were, how it worked. But what this was an Obama education initiative that basically said, we as a country are going to set a few great goals in education, what we in the administration define as reform, right? We're going to have much more use of data to evaluate student and teacher performance. We're going to encourage the creation of charter schools so there are more models for how we teach students. We're going to have much more emphasis on teacher training. A few categories like this that the administration decided were great goals. And then what they did, instead of setting up a few huge federal programs to actually execute against those goals, was they created a pot of money and then said to the states, come up with your best plans for how to get at these goals. Give it your best shot. Get a competition going among the states to figure out how in Washington or how in Delaware and how in Texas, how in Wyoming, people can figure out how they get business leaders and teachers unions and parents and students and people in the community to come together and figure out how you would reform things in your state education system to go after these goals. And what ensued was one of the most incredibly effective leveraged use of federal dollars to be seen in the education arena in our time. Right? Again, you can quarrel with whether you like charter schools as one of their goals or whether you like this particular thing or that thing, but the strategy, the methodology of saying big goals and then setting forth a challenge and a competition among people and states to go after those goals is one that we think is really important. And there are other examples of this in pockets of how government works, right? In the sciences and in NASA, there's a set of grand challenges afoot right now, where NASA, even in a time of declining budgets, in fact, especially in a time of declining budgets, has recognized that one of the most effective ways to make use of the dollars that they do have at their disposal is to follow this kind of big what, small how, issue challenge approach to how they govern.
Yeah, there's another way to understand big what, small how, which is evolution. It's
Right.
literally an evolutionary process.
And one of the things, when you think about this, what that means is when you set in motion when you issue a challenge and set in motion that kind of challenge and competition, what you're doing is setting in motion forces of evolution, right? And our view here is that one of the things that we have to take care to do is to make sure that in governing ourselves, we are continuously asking ourselves, is this adaptive or not? Is the way government is working for us, or is this just a legacy holdover of some other good idea some other time, right? And the ability to continuously adapt, to continuously evolve, and frankly, to prune and to weed, and to end things when they're no longer working or no longer serving their purpose, is a mindset that is too rare in government at every level, but it's one of the things that we believe is an essential aspect of a big what, small how view of the world. One last thing that I would say about big what, small how, as it pertains to some of the points that we were making about the economy. And this goes to the idea of regulation. So again, one of the tropes that we labor against as progressives in the political conversation right now is generally people understand regulation bad, right? Regulation equals evil, right? And the less regulation, the better. And that is a very simple kind of linear formula that people have. There is just a straight line graph that people have in their heads that the more regulation you have, the more it stifles business, the more it chokes the economy, and the less regulation you have, the more the economy is able to flourish and people are able to thrive, right? And I guess one of the ways to give lie to that notion is to consider how many of us wore seatbelts on the way over here if we were driving, right? Not only because those seatbelts might have saved our lives in an accident or a crash, but what those seatbelts did, far from actually choking and killing the auto industry, was to give rise to an auto industry in which there was greater value because cars were understood to be safer, right? In which safety and safeness of a vehicle became itself a driver of economic creation, in which cars and auto manufacturers decided this is a way to sell cars, this is a way to make better cars, right? The idea is true not only of something like seatbelts, but again, something as simple and that we take for granted as clean air and clean water, right? In Beijing right now, where the smog levels on a daily basis are beyond kind of human capacity to tolerate for any long stretch of time, I can tell you that everyday citizens do not think that less regulation equals more thriving and more health, right? That less regulation is bad for the body politic and for the economy over there. There is a sweet spot in which regulation actually enhances economic activity, in which regulation actually enhances our freedom. And this, again, is one of the counterintuitive points in thinking about the role of government, that in order to get true freedom, in order to get more freedom, we have to yield a little bit of freedom, right? So accepting seatbelts, accepting clean air and clean water laws, accepting some regulation of the securitization of financial assets, yes, it is a little bit of a don't tread on me moment, right? It's a little bit of an infringement upon my liberty to pollute however I want, to sell you whatever I want, to build cars with whatever I want. Yes, my liberty to do those things is being infringed by regulation. But that little concession we make to liberty there gives us all collectively and in the longer term far, far more liberty, far, far more freedom to live lives that are actually successful and thriving, in which we as a collective can be all that we are meant to be. And so this idea here is central, again, to a big what, small how understanding, that if you want government itself to adapt, you have to set it in the context of a society that adapts. And a society that adapts is one that recognizes all the ways in which these ideas that we've been talking about here are interconnected.
Yeah. So we are not certain that the ideas in this book are correct. It will be a matter of some debate whether true self-interest is mutual interest, whether we're all better off if we're all better off, if it's true that big what, small how approach to government will work. But what we are certain of is that the extraordinarily one-dimensional way in which we seem to be litigating our politics today will get us nowhere, and that the polarization and the approach that we've taken over the last 10 to 20 years it dooms us to failure. As Eric said, no organism, no institution can survive unless it adapts. And we must find ways to think orthogonally and to manage our affairs in ways which allow us to both anticipate and deal with the fact that the world is changing around us and changing faster and faster. And it is our view that the approaches that we've outlined in this small book, while not perfect, certainly offer us a better shot at facilitating that adaptation than current course and speed.
And just a note to close here before we open it up to a conversation here. The title slide here, which is what we conclude the book with, is this idea that we reap what we sow. And again, a very simple, very old concept, and one which Americans over the last certainly couple of decades have sort of forgotten. Right? Part of the idea of us taking responsibility as citizens is recognizing that the financial collapse and the Great Recession weren't just things perpetrated against us, right? They are things, we are traffic, right? They are things we participated in, right? And we participated in them sometimes very actively by getting involved in the chase to keep up with the Joneses and buy more house than you could afford. Or they were things that we participated in passively by not calling out the insanity of our collective behavior as things unfolded and unspooled in recent years, right? We all own that together. And that notion of responsibility at the smallest level, and the idea that indeed, as I said a moment ago, freedom is not contrary to responsibility. Freedom is responsibility. Freedom is responsibility, for any freedom that matters, right? One of the things that we conclude the book with, and we'll conclude our talk with here today, is a reflection on the second generation of Americans. The first generation were the founders, of course, the people who gave us the charter of our Constitution, the people who gave us the revolution and formed this nation and gave us the framework that has ever since contained our notions of evolution. But it was that second generation, the one that was born into the American Republic, not the one that made it. That's the generation of Daniel Webster. It turns out that for all of our founder worship and for all the ways in which we lionize and want to emulate the founding generation, every one of us, indeed every successive generation of Americans since, has borne far more relation to Daniel Webster's generation. We are all second-generation Americans. We are all people who have been handed, by showing up here as immigrants or by being born here, we've all been entrusted with an experiment. And the previous generation says to us, here, hold this experiment. It's called America. Hold this experiment. You'll see in this little thing there are some things growing over here. There's some weeds cropping up over here. This patch over here is just dead. I don't know what's going on here, right? But here, we've been doing our best with it, this generation. It's your turn, right? And our job as Americans here, as second-generation Americans perpetually, is to make sure that we sustain the health of that garden, that we make sure that we do the seeding, the weeding, the feeding, the tending of the garden of our democracy. And that our job is to ensure not necessarily that we in our own time get all the happiness and wealth that we might want to seek, but that we are able to pass on to the next generation the next second generation of Americans a garden that can thrive, a garden in which all of the fruits of their labor and their wishes and their hopes for opportunity can in fact be borne out. Our belief and hope and our invitation to you is that though we've talked a lot about policy and though we've talked a lot about conceptual ideas, that really all this boils down to is a simple spiritual choice. And as we leave here tonight, the choice is, how are we going to see? Are we going to see each other as if we were cogs in a machine to have little to do with one another and we will all disperse here and go back to our particular other machines? Or shall we leave here tonight and see each other as intertwined in our fates, intertwined in our hopes, intertwined in our dreams, and all together tenders of a great garden called America? Thank you very much.
Thanks.
If you've got any questions or comments you'd like to make, our friends we neglected to mention both at KUOW and the Seattle channel are here, so please go to one of the microphones either side of the stage to ask your question, and be happy to start a conversation.
So you be in charge.
Okay. Carl.
Hey, it seems like we're very much in like company here. That our current president came in with a lot of the values that you're talking about and keeps getting his ass handed to him on a platter when he tries to do the right thing and tries to act in a civil manner to the opposition. And I see him struggle with various ways of engagement and then retreat and then coming back again. And I wonder if you have, in the macro sense, and I'm not sure that there is a solution to this, because I think that the solution is really with us and our individual choices that are going to be driven by the information that we're going to get about how we spend our money and how we make these choices in our lives and live them. But in that macro sense, in that big government thing, is there a way? How do you respond to that? Do you think there's a better choice? Do you think that there's something to do?
I mean, there's all sorts of ways of thinking about the question you pose, but from my point of view, we are engaged in a war of ideas and a war of metaphors. And the thing about metaphors is that they frame both the way you see the world and the information and the evidence around you, right? So you have to reflect on how odd it is that you can make the rich so much richer over 30 years and have this thesis that if the rich get richer, we're all going to be better off, and have such trouble, and nobody's like, what's the problem, right? Like you literally have, John Boehner and Paul Ryan and Eric Cantor standing in front of television cameras literally saying the rich are job creators, and if we tax them more, we'll have less jobs, right? Like literally using those words. And
it seems to be working.
Exactly. Right. This is the astonishing thing, right? And so what we believe is that that works because most Americans literally have a donut machine in their head when they think about the economy, right? Look, just think about for a moment the word regulation, which is how we describe what we do to the economy. It is a mechanical metaphor, right? It is regrettable in connotation and sort of pejorative in meaning. Regulation is what you do to a donut machine when it's broken, right? Like, and regulation sort of constricts it. If you reimagine the economy as an ecosystem, none of that makes any sense anymore. So the thing is that we have
a population of people who have bought this metaphor. And so when somebody says, if you make the rich richer, we'll have more jobs, that makes sense. Because it's actually a fairly consistent, internally consistent worldview. It just happens to be false. And so, it's my belief that if you can push those metaphors out of people's head and say, it's actually not a machine, it's like a garden, it's like a feedback loop, right? And that's why middle-class consumers are the job creators, not the business people. Then all of a sudden that stuff starts to sound crazy, and you can be in a different kind of conversation about taxation. You can be in a different kind of conversation about inequality. You can be in a different conversation about the role of government.
One quick thing that I want to make sure we get a chance to go to some other questions, but one just quick note to add to that. It's not just about metaphor at a conceptual level. What we're talking about here over a medium and long term, over the rest of our lives, say, is changing culture, right? What we're talking about are norms, right? And norms are contagious. Change in norms is slow and gradual for a real long time and then cascades suddenly, right? Witness the Arab Spring, right? Norms about what is permissible there, norms about what notions of what human agency ought to be in different parts of the Arab world have cascaded suddenly. And the outcome remains to be seen, but there's no question that norms are shifting, right? And for us, it's not just about, in fact, it's hardly at all about who our president is and what our president says, right? This is a distributed responsibility for all of us, and for all of us to be setting a different set of norms and changing a culture. I cited the name Race to the Top earlier in terms of the education agenda, but what happens when you have incivility and, turn the other cheek and then get slapped again, is you have a race to the bottom in norms, right? And we have a choice every day whether or not to engage in that normative race to the bottom, right? And again, it's true, we are of like mind here, and this is, a choir of the perhaps already converted. But we all go out in the world. We all go out and encounter people we don't know. We all go out and encounter people we don't agree with or don't know agree with us, right? And the model we set, the example we set as citizens, as everyday members, as people who live in public, is central to this. And I think, the president meant it when he was a candidate and said, we are the change we've been waiting for, right? Voters didn't want to believe that. They wanted to kind of believe he is the change we've been waiting for. He is the change, No, we are the change, right? And either we have and we get exactly the politics we deserve. Right? So what we have right now, dysfunction, polarization, stupidity, bad metaphors, that's exactly what we deserve. Why? Because people like us who are thinking in new ways aren't doing enough yet to make contagious our new way of thinking, right? So, sorry, go ahead.
So let's think about corporations. I agree, it's an ecosystem. Trickle down is not working. Bubble up is what we need. Corporations are not democratic. And corporations have come to dominate not only the economy, but the political system as well. Is it possible, in your estimation, to democratize these institutions, which, if you look historically, have been incubated in the bourgeois democracy that we live in? They began in the 16th century. They've been brought to fruition, as it were. Now they are mature, and they're eating us. Is it possible that we could take possession of them? Do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah. Start? Well, I think that there's no doubt that. So we are huge believers in capitalism, and having spent 4.5 years digging into the science of complex adaptive systems, it becomes clearer and clearer why capitalism is awesome. Because it unleashes evolutionary forces. But capitalism is like pie. There's dirt pie, which tastes lousy, and cherry pie, which is yummy. And we have choices to make about what kind of pie or capitalism we have, right? We can have a yummy capitalism where corporations are constrained in reasonable ways and have a fiduciary duty to people other than just their shareholders, and who aren't treated by the law as citizens and have the same rights, speech rights as citizens. And there is a ton of stuff we need to do to get that back under control, because there is simply no doubt it has gotten wildly out of balance.
Yeah, I would underscore one thing, which is some of you were here when about a month ago Larry Lessig was on this stage, who is a law professor at Harvard who's catalyzing incredible change and effort right now in rethinking how we do campaign finance in this country, and in particular trying to restrain and curb the outsized voice and influence of big money and organized money and corporate power in politics. And the one thing that I would say, apart from campaign finance reform, is one of the opportunities we have right now is changing what we think of as shareholders, right? So companies right now, CEOs are encouraged, public companies are encouraged to think of their job as maximizing shareholder value. And we have an associate, a guy named Bill Budinger, who's a successful business person in Colorado, who has started this new project out of the Brookings Institution, which has a very simple premise. It's a project to explore on both an ethical level and a legal level what it would mean for society to be considered a shareholder, right? And not just as a kind of a rhetorical turn of phrase, but literally to kind of think about how you account for the ways in which any corporation incorporated in the United States has benefits that corporations incorporated, say, in Somalia do not have, right? The rule of law, the ability to have a functioning market, infrastructure, an educated workforce, the absence of random gang violence to disrupt markets, right? This incredible set of investments that is essentially the Commonwealth, right? And that has to be accounted for in the share price, in the market cap of any public company, any private company for that matter, right? That's a somewhat technical matter, but again, it's a matter of, I keep using this word, imagination. How do we see corporations, right? Our view is that there's both a lot of work to be done on the kind of legal front and a lot of work to be done on, again, this normative front of how we see and understand corporations. Yes, sir.
Yes, I really enjoyed your talk. You got me thinking about a number of notions. I like the big government idea, but executed locally or whatever. But I think back to Ross Perot, and what he did is, at least he tried, he came up with these graphs, he tried to explain. Now, a couple of the examples that you used, the example of the education system, the way that worked, we know about the local banks and so forth. So right now, out there, we've got Occupy, going about who knows what, but for good reasons. We have the politicians that are going to go and they're going to say that statement about don't tax the rich. So in other words, what I think we need is we need to be able to somehow tell that story in more detail and more graphically, that if we do some of the things that you spoke of, what's the impact? If you did this and did this, all of a sudden you'll see that that the number of people that can be put back to work. I mean, why is it that that Barack Obama cannot articulate well enough that if we create these job programs, that things will start to get better? So what we need is, I like your paradigms, but we must create these examples so we can demonstrate that to people and give people information that they can use.
Totally agree. Totally agree. And we've started a little bit on that, but I would again say that this is a distributed, shared responsibility, right? What we've started on as we watched the Occupy and the 99% movement catch fire is to try to provide for public conversation facts, statistics, arguments, visual depictions of some of what we've been talking about here, these trends of inequality, the ways in which the wealthiest Americans have used their wealth to become wealthier, right? And to create materials that help the 99% movement make that transition from the raw expression of anger to the making of arguments that can persuade other people. But I think you're right that this is something that, this is a big story that we all have to tell. And we all have to figure out ways. Some of you people are here as business people. Some of you are here as members of unions. Some of you here are good neighbors in neighborhoods. Some of you are parents and grandparents, right? Whatever the domain is, finding the way to translate what we're talking about so that it can be heard in that domain. And that's not a job necessarily for us to do. It's a job for you to think about, how would I translate some of these things so that folks at my kitchen table or my work table or my Bible study circle can understand what we're talking about in ways that stick. And I think that you're right. Visually, it's why we started playing with this first draft of a slide deck here, and I think there's more to be done visually. Thank you. Bill.
Let me say, first of all, I enjoyed your first book and I enjoyed your second book.
Thank you.
Congratulations. You did a
Thank
very,
you, Bill.
very engaging job in both
Thank you.
cases. Seems to me there's a serious omission on this discussion of moderating people's wealth, and that is an absolutely essential ingredient of our economy, of our prosperity, is a thing called risk capital. And you're not going to get risk capital from the middle class. The thing that makes new businesses possible, that makes all kinds of research possible, a whole array of things, by the investment of those who have enough funding to be comfortable and at the same time to generate and make available risk capital.
I would love to address that. Of course, you're right. Risk capital is it's Bill Gates. He's always right, right? Risk capital is an incredibly important and relatively unique feature of the American economy. I mean, let's be clear. As the most entrepreneurial and dynamic economy in the history of the world, we have benefited greatly from that. But all things in moderation, right? First of all, Bill, I would take issue with your first claim that risk capital will not come from the middle class. The overwhelming majority of risk capital available to venture capitalists comes from pension funds, which are from the middle class, right? So a middle class which is more prosperous, which is able to have 401ks, to have pensions, to put money away, creates the same kind of pool of capital that the wealthy individuals can, albeit a wealthy individual has more degrees of freedom with what they can do with their risk capital. But I think I've been on TV shows and radio stations a lot lately talking about taxes and the rich and stuff like that, and I think that people think, because I think the rates should be raised, that I think that we should try to squoosh out rich people. Believe me, I'm rich. I'm all about more rich people, but I think it's awesome. But all things in moderation, right? So since the peak of American productivity, the tax rates on rich people have fallen from around 42% to in the 16–17% range. I simply do not believe that we would eliminate risk capital if we taxed rich people at historic levels again. I don't think that we need to tax the wealthy at 90% or 95%, although it's worth noting that America's economy was growing fastest when tax rates were that high. I mean, it is a matter of fact that it was somehow possible to grow like crazy and have tax rates that high. But I simply do not understand why it makes sense to let somebody who is in the private equity business and deploys other people's capital and makes $500 million or $1 billion or $3 billion a year, how it makes sense that person should pay only 15% tax on that money, and a couple of teachers who work hard together are in the 35% tax rate. So, you know, I think, Go ahead, yeah.
The other thing I would say about this question of risk capital is it's a great reminder of one of these first principle questions and the question here is, what's Wall Street for, right? So part of the idea of why you have Wall Street is so that you can have efficient capital formation so that enterprises can thrive and so that risk capital can be deployed for ventures that might not otherwise get off the ground, right? That is a great theory of what Wall Street is for. And yet we are brought to the crisis that we're in, this long dragging out recession, precisely because Wall Street became something else, right? When you talk about the securitization of mortgages, and you talk about kind of trading credit default swaps against those securitized mortgages, you're talking about this, and to say nothing of when you talk about an arena as you have today where the great proportion of trades executed on any given day on Wall Street are executed by machine, and all they're doing is trying to find milliseconds of arbitrage in tiny little moments, fluctuations of price, right? All we have right now when you have that kind of capitalism on Wall Street is really, really high-tech, really, really well-done casino capitalism, right? And if you add to that a dose of crony capitalism, as you have, you certainly get that much further afield from the original purpose, which was, hey, how can we make, you know, part of the goal, I think, here of the all things in moderation is to make banking boring again, right? Banking shouldn't be as exciting as it is for a lot of these hedge fund guys, right? But that's not to say that banking is bad, nor is it to say that business is bad, right? I mean, again, you don't have to be super rich to believe that capitalism is important, right? Capitalism is important as an evolutionary matter, and it's what brings us here today. But I think the idea that that any curb on banks' casino behavior is somehow some squelching of entrepreneurial animal spirit, some squelching of this ability for venture capitalists to deploy capital and for entrepreneurs to dream up big dreams, I think is misplaced. I think we have a lot more work in the first place just to make Wall Street do well what it initially was intended to do for the economy and for the country.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
This will need to be our last question, so we have time for signing.
Oh.
Okay. Sorry.
I one comment on that 1% is that right now we have 1% whose risk perceptions are driving investment right now instead of a larger percent. And so I don't know if the 1%'s risk perceptions are any more rational in some sort of left brain, right brain sense than ours are, but we know that it's a narrower sector of the economy. And so that being a segue to my question, I'm asking you if I'm being rational or an enormous risk I'm taking. So I'm in the 99%, and I've decided to spend this year investing all the money I was going to spend on a house, and I'm getting really down there, on a project that I want to try to change the brains of young adults to try to pursue ideas about civic engagement very aligned with what you're describing. So my question is this purely quixotic. So let's start from, let me ask you if we share, I know we share a lot. Have you read Master and the Emissary, Ian McGilchrist? Okay, must. So he makes the argument, I'll give you a card with it. He makes the most amazing book I've read in a long time. It's thick. The idea is he makes the argument, very much aligned with yours, that over the course of the last 300 years or so, social changes produced a change in the structure of our brains, right? It's producing the pigs that we are now living with right now. So we're dealing with a multiple generational legacy that is culture in your definition, but we have to also understand that has manifested it in the very structures of our brains, okay? So we accept that. I see you have the brain background for this. So if you take the developmental psychology stuff, right, we know that my brain is not very likely to change much. Yours not. You know, I saw Ian, one of my students back there somewhere, he's in his 20s. His brain is still pretty malleable. He's the one that we have to risk our capital on, is to restructure his brain. Between about 16 and 26 is when we have that opportunity. I think that's the reason why you're on that education board. So the question I have for you then is in a sense, who are you speaking to right now? Are you speaking to all of us that have gray hair or getting gray hair? not likely to help. It's not helping me talking to my dad about his thing, right? We disagree. He's not going to change his mind. I'm decreasingly able to change mine. But Ian and the other ones, like some of these guys, they actually have about twice as many neural connections that we do, and we can still shape them. So is that where we should invest our money? Is that where Bill should be investing the money?
We'll talk to anybody who will listen
so
to
on.
us. So, yeah.
We will talk to anybody who's listening to us, but I guess I'd say a couple things. Look, it's true. I mean, the work that Nick and I do in other parts of our lives around education is fueled by this very same insight, right? And some of you know and have been part of a gathering that I and others organized called the Guiding Lights Weekend, a big national conference on the art of civic mentorship, of what it means to raise great citizens, right? What it means to form one another as great citizens. And so I agree, yes, that focusing on the rising generation is important. And by the way, in answer to the first question, I don't know where you are. No, you're not crazy, and no, this is not quixotic, right? I think the idea of making choices that fuel a sense of purpose and having that purpose be aligned with something that is bigger than just oneself is a very not crazy idea, right? And you're right that our brains are changed, right? I mean, my daughter, who's 12, said as Thanksgiving was approaching that she was really excited about and looking forward to Black Friday. And I stopped for a moment and I was like, "Are you kidding? Like, why? Who? I don't talk about Black Friday, right? But what is it about the kind of messages that the culture has sent her about that there's something kind of exciting?" And for her, it wasn't even necessarily about kind of shopping and being first in line. For her, it just signaled the beginning of this whole season. But let's be honest here, right?
Season of consumption.
The season of consumption, right? It is a season of consumption, right? And so our brains, we respond in Pavlovian ways to these kinds of signals, and we send those signals, and we participate in the sending of those signals. And so it's not just about writing writing off everybody over the age of 30 and saying it's too late to change, because again, I'm fascinated by moments in history where norms shift suddenly. We're in the midst of one right now around gay marriage in this country, right? A fascinating moment where in a few years' time it will seem as odd to most Americans that gay and lesbian Americans couldn't get married as it now seems odd that to my daughter that she could have parents who are of two different races, right? Norms shift suddenly, and they don't shift only because young people have the open-mindedness. We have to have young people. We have to thrive. We have to support the thriving of young people. But norms shift ultimately because older people still, particularly boomers, who are the dominant generation in our politics and economics and civic life, decide they want to change something. If boomers today decided they were anti-consumption, this country would flip. If boomers decided today that retirement isn't about just finding a golf course and just kicking back, but was about serving and mentoring and finding greater public purpose, this country would flip, right? Many of you are boomers here. You have it in your power to change this country because of the sheer throw weight of your generation demographically. I'm from poor, weak little Gen X, right? We're just tagging along, hoping you guys, clear something of a path and don't screw it up before we get there, right? But the boomers have it in your power to completely change and save this country. And so it's a yes and, in my view.
Okay. Listen, I think we're done.
We are.
Thank you
very
so
much.
Thank you so much.